Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I'm Emily Linneman. I'm the Executive Director of UACES. And it's really nice to be here with some of the Lifetime Achievement Award winners that UACES has awarded the prize to over the years. And we have Emil Kirchner from the University of Essex, Bridget Laffan from the EUI, and Jeffrey Edwards from the University of Cambridge. So, first of all, just to get started, it would be great to hear from each of you when you joined UACES and what prompted you to do that in the first place.
I became a member in 1980, and what prompted me was basically trying to meet other people who were in the field, European studies. I thought it was a good opportunity. In those days I was still young, and seeking cohorts of a similar interest was what motivated me. Thank you.
I joined in either 1980 or 81. I was a very young scholar at the time, based at an Irish university, very few people on the island of Ireland working on the EU at the time, and I knew that I had to get off the island to meet people who worked on the EU. And so, in a way, the two different UACES 1 and ECPR were really my training as an academic. That was it really helped me transform myself from an early career scholar into a reasonable scholar. And UACES was, we must remember also in the late 70s, early 80s, that academia was not that internationalized. Political science wasn't as internationalized as it is now. And so these were the opportunities that you met colleagues, like-minded people working on the same things. And for me, it was absolutely central to my development as a scholar.
I joined in 1975, having done European Community issues in the Foreign Office immediately before. So it seemed logical to continue when I left. And I left and I joined the Federal Trust for Education and Research. And UACES rented a single room from the Federal Trust in central London at that point. And so I immediately went on to the committee as an ex officio member, since I was the rent holder, as it were. And at that point, we all crammed into this very small room whenever the committee met.
Yes, yeah, I've sort of seen all that in the minutes and how we used to. Yeah, it's really interesting the way in which we used to kind of obviously have to team up with people in order to be able to have even an office space. Yep. So things have changed, I think. Over the course of your careers, what would you identify as the major changes and shifts in the discipline of European studies?
Well, if I go back, I think there was a lot of theory when I started out. I myself did functionalism, neo-functionalism. I think over a period of about 35 years, if I reflect back, theory has become less dominant, and it's more event-driven. You have the refugee crisis, the Euro crisis, many such events which now seem to sort of dominate the agenda much more. But on the other hand, we have become more comparative, so we have something to offer in terms of in other disciplines. And the same, looking externally, international relations have become sort of more of a focus. So from a more narrow-driven integration theory per se, we have expanded quite a lot over those years, and I think it's been a good thing on the whole.
I would agree with that. We were schooled in the greats, Haas, Hoffmann, Lindbergh and Scheingold, all of those early theories of European integration. And there's always been a dialectic relationship between developments within the EU and scholarship on the EU. And one of the other characteristics of those of us who were involved at a very early stage is that we knew an awful lot about what was happening in the EU. At the time, it was possible to know a lot about lots of policy areas, institutions. But as the EU developed and became a more complex polity and economic space, then the capacity to, in a sense, have a grasp of everything that was happening in the EU declined. So what we saw was a differentiation in scholarship, I think, with much more specialization. Mm-hmm. So people became specialists in different aspects of integration. There were various turns, like the comparative politics turn, the governance turn, the identity turn, the constructivist turn, and all of that was really important. But one of the things that one of the downsides, I think, was, as Emile said, it was then became somewhat events driven, and we forgot some of the larger issues of European integration, the big macro questions of the nature of the polity that was developing. So there's been enormous change.
I'm not so sure I'd agree with that last point there. Of course, there's been huge change, and it's certainly true that the discipline, if we want to call it a discipline, has expanded as the competences of the European Union have expanded necessarily. And I think it is still the case that the political scientists dominate, and we lack economists, we lack lawyers, and so on in the right numbers of sociologists. And I think that was mentioned at the conference, but. One of the things I think has been so interesting in terms of that widening of interest and preoccupation, it has also meant specialization. So it does mean that we've been widening and deepening at the same time, which I think has been all to the good. But I don't think we've necessarily lost sight of some of the bigger issues. I mean, we've had 2 or 3 panel discussions, even at this conference, on the bigger issues, whether it's the particular issues of migration or the Euro crisis, but it's been set within a context of integration, disintegration. It's been set within a context which has also a strong theoretical bias. And I think one of the interesting things about theoretical development is that we've given up, yes, the grand theories, but we now seem to have such huge variety of different mid-range theories, which I think is particularly interesting. Because when you think in terms of international relations, for example, it's nearly always been the case that the Brits and other Europeans have been off to America to learn what the latest theoretical position is. Whereas on European issues, okay, so we had trouble becoming recognized as a particular discipline rather than just an offshoot or something. But I think now the Europeans offer the Americans some innovative and interesting new ideas about theory, which, is all to the good, I reckon.
Can I just say that when I said we'd lost sight of the big questions, I think they're back on the table because of the crises of the last 10 years. But before then, one could read paper after paper that one learnt a lot about the minutiae of particular decision routes.
Very descriptive.
Policy, but not the bigger question. But in a way, crises have forced the big questions. So you're absolute. I mean, we don't disagree. I think that the big questions are now back on the table. And in a way, the study of the EU both contributes to the development of social science and is now mainstream in the social sciences.
I don't know whether you want to sort of add the major challenges, I think. One was, and still is intriguing us, interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. We started out with this great sort of concept, we European studies, because we bring in the different disciplines, economists, lawyers, and so on, interdisciplinarity. And it's been hounding us in many ways. We started out, I remember my own experience at Essex. We had 6 departments at one stage coming together. And then the research assessment exercise basically blew a big hole into that, back to your department it was. And so it is still an enormous challenge. And when you go to the Chamonix Action Programme, they still emphasize interdisciplinarity in the projects, in the teaching, and so on. But it is a huge challenge. And in my opinion, rather than having succeeded, we're actually having, in a regressive way, gone the opposite way. It's regrettable, but, it's just one of those things in a quite sort of adventurous way we started out. Yes, interdisciplinary, we have something to offer European studies which others do not do, but it remains to be a challenge.
I think the new plans for, say, which I think has become Ref 2021, they do mention interdisciplinarity, but I'm not sure they're really providing a solution on how they're actually going to assess interdisciplinary research within the kind of framework that's currently set up. Do you think UACES has a role to play in helping to kind of improve interdisciplinarity and improve if it needs to be improved? If you want to say that that's a good or a bad thing, or whether it's just that it's a concept that needs revisiting.
But I think UACES has always been faced with the problem and has always been trying to overcome it. Whether it was in the 1970s trying to get more economists. I think when we appointed Peter Robson as editor of JCMS, the idea was to get an economist to try and bring fellow economists in. And we've never had quite so much trouble with the lawyers. Alan Dashwood was there from the beginning and so on. So lawyers have not been such a problem. But it has been the economists who, for their own reasons, have been drawn away from anything, as far as I can see, anything practical, into number crunching and so on, rather than anything else. And I'm not sure UACES or anybody else in political science has the problem, has the ability to overcome it.
Economics as a discipline, it's one of the few disciplines in the social sciences that has a high level of confidence in what it does and how it operates.
Misguided.
And economists tend to, you can go to any economics department in the world and they all behave the same way. They know what the 5 top journals are, and that's what they do. Exactly, and they're very theoretical. I think one of the things that the crisis, particularly the financial crisis, the global and not just the European, has done is it's brought political economy back into fashion. And if one can't, in a sense, if there isn't, it isn't possible to co-opt the theoretical economists, then I think economic historians and political economists is where there might be some leverage.
I think via business schools and so on.
And via some of the best economics is being done in business schools today.
Yeah, and it is so reflected. You look at the Journal of Common Market Studies, you look at the Journal of European Integration. The contributions by economists is very small because, as stated, they have their number 1, number 2, number 3 economist journals. They want to be seen in there. And it's sort of, they don't want to waste their time literally publishing something somewhere which they know they don't get the recognition. So it's opportunity cost, as they call it.
So we've talked about the discipline and how that's changed, and how definitions or understandings of interdisciplinarity have shifted. What about academia as a whole? So the academic profession, how do you feel that's changed over your time as a member of UACES?
I mean, I think just one, because I'm not sure I can answer the bigger question, but one of the things that I find really interesting is the way in which, especially in European studies, in its relation to the academy and in relation to policy, where we really have had trouble all throughout our history, in a sense. That at the outset we were always considered to be so pro-European, we were always suspect. That fell perhaps into abeyance once the UK became a member and so on. But we were always, in a sense, suspect from international relations or political theorists and so on as being perhaps a bit too policy oriented, perhaps forgetting some of the bigger issues and so on. And that has had real problems simply because, after all, we did have something to offer policy. And there's a structural problem insofar as policymakers always wanted to talk to us. It's been terribly easy to talk to officials, whether in national capitals or especially in Brussels. So we've always had this close relation with practitioners, which to some of the more recherché international relations scholars has always been problematic for us. I think that problem of us being fairly close to the practitioners has led us to be suspect in the eyes of some of the other disciplines. I think that has now changed with the REF, insofar as we're all now constructing these little relevant narratives.
Impact studies.
Exactly.
So perhaps the circle has come round and we're less suspect, but we're actually still involved with policy.
I think in terms of, there are 2 ways really of looking at that. we have made a tremendous contribution to academia when you look at the number of journals which have been created, the number of books which have come on the market. I mean, yeah, that's a huge contribution. Secondly, we have opened also something called comparative regionalism, which science hasn't done, IR hasn't done. And that, I think, is actually in many ways the future, this comparative regionalism, where we really open up in many ways and learn from what is happening in Asia, in Latin America, as well as they learn from us, from the European experience. And I think this has been delightful in many ways, but a huge contribution to academia. So we should be proud of ourselves in some ways as to the contributions we have made. Yes, there are those niggling questions about in terms of ref and so on. It's always, when you compare then interdiscipline, well, where have you published? Where is the Journal of Common Market Studies ranked? Or where is the Science Review ranked and so on? Yeah, I mean, there are differences. But, it's only one way of looking at the other ways.
I would say I've observed two big shifts in academia over my career, not just in European studies. One is the internationalisation of our universities. That academic markets, particularly the UK academic market, but not only, are much more open than they were. When we started, most of the departments were almost monocultural, mono-national, whereas now there's been a dramatic change and shift in that. And I think European studies attracts a multinational, multicultural group of scholars precisely because of what we're working on. And then the other quite different dynamic has been when I joined as a young scholar, the department would tell me what its expectations were of me in terms of teaching. But it really didn't bother me much after that. I got, you developed your course outline, you delivered your lectures, you assessed your students, and you did your own work, and you went to departmental meetings, but it was all very calm and collegiate. Whereas over time, driven by increase in student numbers, more centralization within universities, academic life has changed and it's much less self-regulation and much more top-down regulation than when I started out. And the other thing I've observed is when I was a very young scholar, our universities still had what we would call in Ireland characters. Professors of history who spent the afternoon in the pub regaling their students with all sorts of stories. Universities don't have room for these people anymore.
I think there's one other aspect worth mentioning, and that is looking a little bit at the outside. The Chamonix Action Programme has done really a substantial help to us as European studies lecturers and researchers. The funding alone is in many ways, we had chairs, we had modules, and then later on centers, and now projects and networks and so on. It's a huge contribution. Secondly, the Erasmus Programme, we should not forget. I mean, again, we profited from that. The exchanges which have taken place and so on. We plugged into a kind of framework which, if we had to create that on our own, that would have been extremely difficult. So I think we should give credit there too, to where we got help from.
Yes.
All of which raises questions.
Exactly.
I mean, in terms of funding, in terms of teaching, and teachers, and in terms of students.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick up on, Bridget, on what you were saying about internationalisation of higher education generally, and I just wondered what your thoughts were, particularly someone who hasn't worked in UK academia, but how UACES has affected academics, universities outside of the UK.
Well, I mean, it's very clear to me that UACES is, USA in the US at one time may have been larger and may have attracted a larger number of people to its biannual conference. But for certainly the last 10 years, I think UACES is the largest European Studies Association in the world. Certainly the largest in Europe, but I think in the world. And so it is hugely important to scholars, not just within UK academia, but European academia. You tend not to get Americans travelling to Europe for conferences that much, but certainly it's a multi-European association now, and that's been a very important. It's been very important in terms of what it does for young scholars, not just in providing the opportunities to deliver the first and early paper, but all of the other things it does for young scholars. So I would say, Ireland had a very small association of European studies that I was secretary of for several years, but we were tiny. So without UACES, we'd have been locked into this tiny academic community. So I think it's been hugely important, not just in the UK context, which is obviously its role, but much more widely in European terms.
I think I just emphasise the point about young scholars, because I think that's been a critical role for UACES. But I think also the way in which it's not just giving papers at conference, at the annual conference, but the funding of smaller conferences and research groups.
So, going forwards, we've obviously mentioned one of the particular challenges that's coming down the road for European studies. But what do you see as the major developments in European studies in the next few years? And you may want to bring into that Brexit and how that might affect the discipline.
Well, I think youth has to be the focus. If we do not now recruit sufficiently, and there are dangers because Brexit being one, we have de-emphasizing European studies now for some time, language programs have gone down. If we lose sight of that, I think then the future looks indeed very bleak. So, whatever efforts can be made to reach out and help bringing those young scholars or PhD students, MA students even to some extent, into the fold, I think the more important that will become. So that's certainly one development, and Brexit is coming. The second is what we referred to already, the need to engage more in comparative regionalism, so that, we as UACES go out and sort of say, okay, UACES in America, what are they doing? Arbeitskreis, Germany, but also looking at Asia, it's becoming now more and more a focus there, enterprising in terms of the conferences and so on. So comparative regionalism, I think, we have to show the young scholars it's not just Europe, it's part of this drive to sort of say, right, this global environment, whether it's climate change and so on, we can connect. So I think the two are linked in many ways, looking at youth, trying to sort of bring them in, and offering them sort of more scope in terms of what can be done, comparative regionalism. That's not to say that, IR, again, should not be excluded either, but I think we need to sort of be thinking a little bit more sort of in terms of how can we move on, do the good things we have done in the past, and, complement them with some new ideas.
I would say, firstly, in substantive terms, what are the sorts of areas we need to focus on to understand and get a better grasp of what's happening? I would say we know a lot about systems of multi-level governance, the actor constellations, the policies. We know a lot less about multi-level politics and the problems therein. And so I would say we need to marry multi-level governance and multi-level politics, which requires those who work on elections, public opinion, to work with people who work more on policy processes. So I think that's disaggregated at the moment, and it's problematic. I fully agree on the comparative regionalism, the role of the EU in the world, a perennial area of research, extremely important, and the relationship between European integration, interdependence and wider processes of globalization. So I would say there's a whole in other words, there are a lot of substantive issues that are analytically challenging, theoretically challenging, and empirically challenging out there. So there's no shortage of substantive issues. Then on the supply side, or what Brexit may mean, I think we simply don't know yet. I would envisage that the UK will ask and to continue to be part of Horizon 2020, the Monet programs and all of that, and will pay a fee for that, and therefore the United Kingdom universities will continue to be part. But there's something about not being a member state that plays into the dynamic.
Of course.
In terms of, I was very struck in, I'm part of a consortium at the moment that's developing a bid for Horizon 2020. We're not the coordinators. But I was very struck by someone saying, well, we can have one UK partner, but certainly not two. In other words, they're factoring in the shift in the UK. So I think that there will be costs, unfortunately, and consequences, although I don't envisage a situation where UK universities will be completely outside these programs. That's not what I envisage. But whereas now the UK is a leader, it will forgo that leadership position. And that is detrimental to higher education in the UK, but also to Europe, because the UK has an extremely strong and vibrant higher education system, and there's no reason for it to marginalise itself within the EU, but unfortunately the macro political dynamics are much greater. I think that paradoxically the European question will bedevil the United Kingdom following Brexit. And whereas this was a relatively low salient issue in politics prior to the Bloomberg speech in 2013, yes, it bothered some people, but it really wasn't seen as a major issue by most people. I would predict, regardless of how Brexit pans out, in other words, what form of Brexit, the European question will bedevil the United Kingdom for decades ahead. And I remind everyone of the role of the Irish question in British politics in the 19th century and 20th century. And the Irish question was rarely off the agenda. It brought governments down. It had a major influence on parliamentary processes in the United Kingdom. It was a major constitutional issue, and it was never resolved until, paradoxically, I would say 2011, when the Queen visited Dublin or Ireland. The irony is that Brexit has destabilised that normalisation in relation to Ireland, but that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that the European question is now core on the UK agenda, political agenda. It is the big issue, and it will not be resolved by Brexit.
No, absolutely not. Just on the Brexit issue, talked about research. I mean, I hope in the bargain that we may be able to strike in terms of remaining within the research area, that somehow we can also manage to keep European students as domestic students rather than foreign students. I mean, I've always been amazed why we get so many European students now, when we charge them quite so much and they can be pretty much free of fees at home. If they now become international students, this is going to have a terrible effect. But the other thing that I think about Brexit is not the research and not the students, it's the actual people who are teaching. And I think the degree of uncertainty, the incompetence of the Home Office, the lack of credibility that the Home Office has got in terms of sending letters off to people, absolutely appalling. I mean, how anybody could have any trust in the British government sometimes amazes me, because I think that degree of uncertainty and the unpredictability of tenure and so on is an appalling issue.
Do you think UACES, as a membership organisation, can do anything to support its members, to mitigate some of these challenges? Do you think it should have a role in this sort of thing?
I mean, is UACES about to establish a centre in Brussels, become a European body, so that it can still receive funding and so on. And that might be one answer. But I think the point that's been made earlier, if we're one of the largest group of European studies, then the network is likely to continue. After all, Brexit is not the priority of anybody else in Europe. There are an awful lot of other issues and problems that will still need to be studied and researched and so on. And we can make a contribution, and as Bridget said, I think everybody would hope that we could still make a contribution to that.
I would say that UACES has got to, because it's focused on the study of Europe and bringing together people who work on Europe, it has a fundamental role to play in the next phase, because Europe will still be an issue for the United Kingdom, but also the dynamic of integration. There are all those issues, and given that there's such a concentration of scholars, I do think that UK universities will become less attractive to continental Europeans.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate, because even though Brexit is, we're not leaving Europe is the strapline, well, that's not how it feels to everyone else. It's seen as leaving Europe. But I think domestically there's also a very important role to play, educational role to play, because one of the most striking things about the referendum campaign, and even now, is the lack of basic knowledge of how the EU works. And we know that if people don't know and don't understand the political system, there are issues of trust and buy-in. And I'm very struck by people who should know, don't know.
But who didn't want to know. That was the really sad thing about the campaign.
And so I think UACES also has a very important educational role and public information role to play in the future. Because it's not that I expect everyone walking the streets to understand how the EU operates, because if you ask them how the Polish Parliament operates, if we went out and did a vox pop now, they wouldn't. But it's that they know enough to feel comfortable, whereas clearly that was not the case in relation to the EU during the campaign. And I think, of course, the problem the UK faces with the press on this issue is very serious, because it's misinformation, it's deliberate misinformation. So I think UACES, in a sense, becomes more rather than less necessary, but obviously will have to work in a more challenging environment.
Yeah, I agree with all what has been said, really, what can or should be done. I think there might be two other areas. We have the Academy of Social Sciences in this country. And one of their really big objectives is to fight cuts, educational cuts, to support drives like European studies, I would assume, to link with them. Ivor Crewe is, for example, now the chair of that Academy of Social Sciences. I'm a fellow of that, so that is why I know what is going on and the campaigns they introduce, which is really quite far-reaching. They even publish pamphlets on the topic and so on. So I think you should perhaps link with them. And the second is, the only really European institution is the European Parliament I can sort of see become more representative or seek contacts with MEPs. I know they will not be British anymore, but otherwise use perhaps some of your colleagues, Germany, France, and so on, to lobby on behalf and so on. Because overall it is still in the interest of the European Parliament to, promote our cause, so to speak. So this would be the two areas I can see some scope.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for sharing your thoughts, and hopefully it's given UACES some food for thought for the next 50 years as well. So,
that would be it.
That would be
We're knocking on the door in 50 years.